Kelly Hyman in Miami, Florida, and in Atlanta, Georgia, trial attorney and former president of the National Bar Association, C.K. Hoffler. Ladies, thank you for joining us today. C.K., to you first. He's pretty dynamic. He's walking around the room. He's talking about, his apology. I want your thoughts on that, but then also thanking the jury for their service. Just overall, what's your impression of his closing remarks right now?
Well, Matt, I think that he's doing a good job of establishing charisma, establishing passion, and representing his client. He's apologizing because, in a case like this, I'm sure somebody's offended someone. You've got gang people who are testifying. You've got a lot of probably hard-fought cross-examination. And so the jurors probably have expressed some shock and probably been offended at some point. So he's apologizing for that, and he's using that classic tactic: please don't hold what we did against our client, against this defendant, against this young man, because the penalty is he'll go to jail for life or he'll be killed. And so I think is just sort of situate the jury and bring them back to reality. And then what he's doing, he's pivoting and saying they really don't have any evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. They have some evidence that you may be able to interpret, but there's no evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. These text messages that are referenced, we don't know if they came from him, because I don't know about this analogy to when his wife picks up his phone. I think that's very weak. But the concept that he's trying to instill or discuss with the jurors is, look, anyone could have sent those messages. This is the life that they lead. Tons of people there. It may not have come from him.
Yeah,
so I think he's doing a fairly decent job at that, man.
Yeah, and you know what? You both have charisma as well. That's why we keep you on the show. Thank you. Let's talk about some of that evidence, though, Kelly, that CK was bringing up. I mean, they don't have a gun. They don't have the GSR residue. They don't have an eyewitness. So what do they have? Have they connected the dots, according to what you've seen?
Right, you bring up a really good point, and digressing, you definitely have charisma as well. But I keep hearing him say reasonable doubt, and I want him to explain that to the jury. I want him to explain what that is, to go through the elements of what the prosecution has to prove and show and break it down and say what they have and what they don't have. And based on that he cannot be convicted. I think that's going to be really key to tie up loose ends, to connect things together, to say, look, they didn't make the connection. That's what they're supposed to do. And I think that's going to be key. Hopefully that's something he's going to bring up later in his arguments, but I think that's something really compelling that the jury needs to hear.
Absolutely. We're going to have to fit in a quick break, but you know what? I just think that the closing remarks by the defense are just really animated and fun to watch. We're going to pick back up where we left off coming up after this break.
Tonight on Closing Arguments, after years, an arrest has finally been made in the Long Island serial killings. Now we're learning more and more about the suspect as new details come to light. Our experts break down the investigation, the evidence, and what's next for the defendant. And on the docket, Taylor Schabusiness is accused of a heinous murder, but will she be found competent to stand trial?
Closing Arguments with Vinny Politan, tonight at 8/7 Central, only on Court TV.
Welcome back. You're watching Court TV Live. I'm Matt Johnson in for Ted Rollins today. The defense is giving closing arguments in the double murder trial of rapper YNW Melly. Melly, also known as Jamel Demons, is accused of staging a drive-by shooting that killed two of his childhood friends. Now, if convicted, he could face the death penalty. Let's get you back into court now for more of the closing arguments with the defense attorney, Stuart Adelstein.
11 witnesses, very careful. And why do I say that? Because when you look at these 11 witnesses, you will find out that there's a conflict in the testimony, that there is a lack of testimony, and the third way is from the testimony itself. The first one that I would like to talk about Well, before I talk about the first witness, I want you to remember one thing. On October 26th, that day of the shooting, we learned immediately that that Jeep was taken to a secure area, and it was searched for over 15 hours by 2 crime scene technicians. And you heard how they pulled out the evidence. They got some foam, some projectiles, I think a can, everything, and photographed the vehicle. Now, why is that important? Because that vehicle was searched. You okay? Want to take a break? That vehicle was searched again months later. But it didn't stop there, because about 3 years later, miraculously, even though it was searched for hours by crime scene technicians, Sergeant Williams comes into the scene at the request of the state of Florida, this particular prosecutor right here, and miraculously he finds additional evidence, 2 projectiles and a bloodstain that obviously everyone else missed. That should tell you something about the quality of this investigation. That should give you a clue as to what's going on in this case. What happened was, once they got the surveillance tape of the individuals leaving the studio, they knew that Cortland Henry, Williams, Thomas, and this young man got into the Jeep. It's shown on the video. In the Mitsubishi were Adrian Davis, Patrick DeLoach, Trevon Glass, and I'm missing one other. Withers, Dontavius Withers. And we know that on October 26th, when Moretti saw that surveillance, Cortland Henry identified all of them, and in fact told them that he lives at this young man's house I made a mistake. Jacoby Mills was in the car. It was Jacoby Mills, Adrian Davis, Trevon Glass, and Dontavius Withers. Okay? I can't keep the names straight. I'm lucky if I can remember my own name. That's why I have it written down. We know that Moretti identified all 8 people that left the studio on October 26th. We also know that Moretti knew where this young man lived, along with all the other 7 people that left the studio. We all know that, according to the state, Cortland Henry lied to the police. And we also know, as the investigation progressed, that Cortland Henry had blood matching the victim on his clothes. And he also had GSR, or gunshot residue, on his clothes. If that were true, and you saw the pictures of the Jeep, all bloody, blood all over the place, and we learned that you could spray and determine if there was blood right here on the carpet, even though you don't see it, why in the heck don't you get a search warrant for the house? Why in the heck don't tell us we didn't know where he lived? Don't tell us it was months later, because they go into the car 4 years later and do this. So why don't you do it? Because Detective Moretti and the Miramar Police Department as everyone has said, lacks the experience and the training. We don't have to do a darn thing, folks. We don't have to do a thing. But let's go into the 11 witnesses now. The first one, and they mentioned it, George Bello, the manager, the head guy of the gun and tool mark unit of the entire Broward Sheriff's Office. And he tells you, after we get a great education of guns and projectiles and casings, we have to bring out the fact that can you tell or determine the distance between the shooter and the victim? Can you tell us that with all your experience? And what does he say? I can't do it unless I have the weapon, unless I have the ammunition, because ammunition, the weight of ammunition would change could change the distance. And you have to have the weapon in order to do that. He cannot even tell us if it was one gun, two guns, or more. He's honest. He tells you that without the weapon used, I cannot place the shooter to the victim, or victims in this case. Now, why is that important? Because a reasonable doubt can arise from a conflict in the testimony. If you believe George Bello, and I suggest you should, then he totally contradicts all the testimony of Sergeant Williams, who comes in here 4 and 5 years later and says, I can tell you where shooter one was, and I can tell you who the shooter is. You talk about a conflict in the testimony? It's one or the other. It can't be both. And he tells you, in addition to that, that the environment has to be considered. Now, Williams tells you he goes out to the scene some 4 or 5 years later and has no idea, nor did he even check the terrain, the environment on that particular morning hour. So you got to believe one or the other. You can't believe both of them because they are in direct conflict with each other. But let's go further. The next witness that you should consider is FBI agent Brendan Collins. He is an expert in tracking phones. He is not only an expert in Broward County, but he's an expert, and his team have been specially trained to map phones, not only in this country, but anywhere in the world if he's called upon. They brought him in. And what does he tell you? This expert. I cannot determine precisely the location of a phone.
The defense attacking the testimony of each of the witnesses there as he gives his closing arguments. Don't worry, we are going to pick up right back in that Florida courtroom when we come back with the YNW Melly double murder case. You're watching Court TV, your front row seat to justice.
Business, accused of killing a man and later dismembering his body.
The details are something out of a terrible nightmare.
Leaving the head of the victim in a bucket.
It is an absolute horror show.
It's a bizarre case that's already seen its share of fireworks.
Business violently attacked her own attorney.
So what is the defense here?
Anything is possible when it comes down to a jury trial.
The House of Horrors murder trial. Live coverage coming soon, only on Court TV.
And welcome back. The defense is giving closing arguments in the double murder trial of rapper YNW Melly. Melly, whose real name is Jamel Demons, is charged with staging a drive-by shooting to cover up the murders of two friends. He says that he didn't do it, that he was home asleep at the time. Let's get you back into court now for more of the closing arguments from defense attorney Stuart Adelstein.
Sergeant Williams, and I think I've talked a bit about him. And I think the most amazing part of his testimony is that he does not get involved in this case until 3 years after the incident. Again, at the request of the state. Again, because they realize they have problems. And I applaud them to recognize they have problems. And miraculously, as I told you earlier, even though the Jeep was searched for hours and hours, processed for hours and hours, he finds additional evidence. 2 projectiles that everyone else missed, and a blood stain that is important. And that when he did his analysis, 2 important things occurred. He didn't go in there blindly to do any analysis. He told you that the prosecutors in this case told them that the defendant in this case was this young man. And we need you to do a trajectory analysis to put him on the scene. Now, I suggest to you, you could have a Jolly Green Giant and a midget. And if you give them the dimensions, the height and his arm length, with this mathematical formula, you could say the Jolly Green Giant or the midget was a shooter in this case. They would either be closer to the car or further from the car, depending upon their size. If you want to do an analysis, if you want to do an investigation, if you want to figure out who the shooter is, why do you point to this kid and tell him, this is what we want? Why do you do that? This is the great investigation. This is what they want you to do in order to render a verdict that could take him. And tell him that he's going to live life in the state penitentiary without parole or be on death row. This is the investigation they want you to rely upon and say it's proof beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt? I guess so, according to them. And they call Danny Benitez. Who the heck is he? He was on the stand for all of about 2 minutes. Danny Benitez gave Detective Moretti the surveillance tape from the Montessori school. You watched it. It showed, I suggest, nothing probative to implicate this young man in it. But we learned, not from him, but from Moretti, that he doesn't go to the drugstore on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Applebee's to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Polo Tropical or the gas station or the bank on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tapes. When the car's on 184th Avenue, he doesn't go to the fire station to check their tapes, surveillance tapes. Doesn't go back to the 2 elementary schools, Sunset Lakes and West Broward Elementary, to check their surveillance tape, because he knows it all. He knows it. How do you know it if you don't check it? How do you know something unless you investigate it? We don't have to do a thing, folks. We don't have to do anything except show up. And begrudgingly, we did. Where the Montessori school was, on Pines, there was a tractor supply company and another school. Why don't you get that? And come in here and say, you know what, folks? We checked all of this. Instead, what they do is take a helicopter ride 4 or 5 years later. And we have to sit here and watch as they fly the route. And we have to watch how they drive the route. Not checking what the traffic conditions were that day, back 4 or 5 years ago. Not checking what the weather was 5 years ago in October 26th. What's the purpose of that? Just to add more of what I suggest is a smoke screen. You look at all this and say, heck, man, 100 exhibits, 500 photographs out of a cell phone, all these text messages. What does it mean? Hopefully, for the state, you'll say, hey, where there's smoke, there must be fire. And say, hey, too bad, young man, too bad. There's a lot of stuff sitting here.
What do you think? Is he sowing reasonable doubt? Let's bring in our attorneys that are standing by. Trial attorney and host of Once Upon a Crime in Hollywood podcast, Kelly Hyman in Miami, Florida. And in Atlanta, Georgia, trial attorney and former president of the National Bar Association, C.K. Hoffler. Kelly, to you first. So, you know, he's trying to weave in reasonable doubt. He's attacking conflicting testimony, lack of evidence, and lack of training by Miramar police there in Florida. Your thoughts?
No, absolutely, and I think he's doing a good job of it. Basically, defense has 2 roles: one is to show that the prosecution didn't prove every single element of the cause of action, and then poke holes in the evidence which they provided to the jury. So I think he's doing an excellent job in regard to that. But going back, I want him to go through each element and explain to the jury what is reasonable doubt and what that means and what that burden is and what if the prosecution did not show that.
Yeah, and CK, my ears perked up when I heard him mention not once but twice about penalty, life in prison or the death penalty possibly. What would you have done?
I would not have done that. But I didn't hear an objection. So objections have to be spontaneous. You can't sort of later say, well, you know, Judge, I meant to object. I didn't want to interrupt his flow. So I would not have done that, because I think that they're in different jurisdictions, of course, have different rules, and I am licensed in Florida, but I think that is a no-no, but there was no objection. So even when there's a no-no, if there's no objection, then, you know, you pretty much waive the ability to bring it and say that it's error on appeal. I think that that is not permissible. I think it's ill-advised at best, and I certainly would not have done that.
Kelly, what are you listening for?
I'm listening for him to go through the elements, to say, these are the elements, this is what we're going to look at, and what reasonable doubt is, and how the prosecution failed to do their job and prove that each element of the crime. That's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting to wrap him up.
CK, in short, have you heard reasonable doubt?
I've heard reasonable doubt. I really have. And but he does. I agree with Kelly. He's got to go through, wrap it up.
All right, we have to leave it there. Thank you, ladies, for joining us. Joining me right now, my time is up, is Judge Ashley. You're going to pick up our coverage.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Matt. We are going to stay in closing arguments. You won't miss a thing. Stay here, Court TV, your front row seat to justice.